I used to think my last years would be quiet. I pictured myself in the old recliner by the window, maybe with the baseball game playing low on the TV, a cup of coffee cooling in my hand, and the sun setting behind the maple trees in my backyard. I thought I'd have time to tinker in the garage, fix up my fishing boat, and maybe take it out on the lake every other weekend. No alarms, no lunchboxes to pack, no bedtime battles. That was before the knock on the door. It was early, too early for visitors. The coffee pot had just started gurgling in the kitchen when the sound echoed through my little house, 3 quick knocks like someone in a hurry. When I opened the door, my daughter stood there, hair a mess, eyes red, and holding the small hands of my 2 grandkids. "Dad," she said, voice cracking, I can't do this anymore." Behind her, the sun was barely up, painting the frost on the grass in pale gold. The kids looked up at me with a mixture of confusion and trust, as if they knew I would say yes before I even understood the question. I didn't ask why, not right away. Maybe it was shock, maybe instinct, but I stepped aside and let them in. The smell of cold morning air followed them into the living room. My granddaughter, Sophie, clutched her stuffed rabbit so tight its ear looked ready to fall off. My grandson, Jack, held onto the strap of his tiny backpack like it was a lifeline. My daughter set the bags down, kissed them quickly on the forehead, and whispered, "I'll call you," before walking back out the door. I stood there, still in my flannel pajama pants, coffee brewing in the kitchen, watching her walk away without looking back. That was 3 years ago. If you're hearing this story for the first time, let me tell you, it's not a sad story. Not really. It's a story about the way love changes shape when you least expect it. And if you're listening on YouTube right now, maybe with your own coffee in hand, I hope you'll stick around until the end. If my story touches something in you, if it reminds you of your own family or a moment you can't forget, I'd be grateful if you hit the like button, maybe subscribe and share it with someone who might need it. Because sometimes, the stories we tell are all we have to keep certain truths alive. That first morning, I didn't even have cereal in the pantry that the kids would eat. My fridge was a bachelor's fridge, milk close to expiration, leftover chili in a Tupperware, a carton of eggs, and a half-empty jar of peanut butter, but I made do. I fried eggs, toasted some bread, and watched as Sophie carefully cut her toast into squares while Jack stuffed his eggs into the toast and called it a breakfast taco. "Where's Mommy?" Jack asked between bites. "She had to take care of something," I said, avoiding Sophie's watchful eyes. She was older, only 8 at the time, and she could read the weight in my voice. She didn't push, though. She just ate in silence, her small hands steady with the fork. After breakfast, I took them into the spare room, what had been my little office, and started clearing space. The desk went into the garage. I dug out the old bunk bed I'd taken apart years ago and set it up, my back aching with every bolt I tightened. Sophie chose the top bunk without hesitation. Jack didn't argue. That night after I'd tucked them in, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the quiet phone. I thought about calling my daughter, demanding answers. But every time I pictured her voice, I remembered the way she'd looked that morning, like someone carrying more than she could hold. And I couldn't bring myself to add more weight. So I didn't call. The days blurred into weeks. My life became a rotation of school drop-offs, grocery lists, laundry, and bedtime stories. My fishing boat sat untouched in the driveway, covered with a blue tarp that flapped in the wind. My old buddies from the shop would call and ask if I wanted to grab a beer, and I'd tell them maybe next week. Next week rarely came. Money became tighter than I expected. Retirement had been a few months away when that knock on the door came. I'd worked as a mechanic for 40 years, my hands scarred from wrenches and heat, my hearing dulled from the clank of metal and the hiss of air compressors. I had enough saved to coast into my 60s comfortably, until suddenly I didn't. Kids don't run on a retiree's budget. They grow out of shoes overnight, they eat like they've got hollow legs, and they need field trip money, lunch money, book fare money. I started doing odd jobs around town, changing oil for neighbors, fixing up lawnmowers, even repairing the church van one Saturday when the pastor's call came in desperate. Some nights, I'd collapse into bed so tired my bones ached. But in the quiet moments, when Sophie would crawl into my lap with her reading homework or Jack would drag me outside to see the fort he'd built with sticks and an old tarp, I felt something I hadn't in years: purpose. One night, about 6 months in, Sophie asked if I missed my old life. I thought about the lake, the recliner, the quiet mornings. I do, I admitted, but I think this is where I'm supposed to be. She smiled a little, the kind of smile that looks borrowed from a future version of her, older, wiser, maybe telling her own kids one day about the time she lived with her grandpa. Jack interrupted with a fart noise against his arm, and Sophie groaned. The moment passed, but it stayed with me. It still does. Looking back now, I realize that morning, the knock on the door, wasn't the start of my burden. It was the start of my second chance. I'd missed things when my own daughter was that age. Long shifts, overtime, the kind of exhaustion that makes you a ghost in your own home. I told myself I was doing it for her, for the family. Maybe I was, but I'd give anything to go back and listen more, to be present in a way I never was. Now I had that chance. With them. Of course, I didn't know then what was coming. The day their mother would return, the day she'd take them away and tell the world it was her love, her effort, her sacrifice that had shaped them. I didn't know that my quiet acceptance would be tested in ways I never imagined. But I knew this: when the moment came to choose between my plans and my people, I chose my people. And I'd do it again. The thing no one tells you about taking care of kids again in your 60s is that the world they live in isn't the same as the one you raised your own children in. When my daughter was little, her favorite show came on once a week at 7 p.m. And if you missed it, you waited until next week. Now, Sophie and Jack could pull up entire seasons on a screen that fit in their hands. I had no idea how to set up parental controls, and the first time Jack nearly bought a $49.99 Mega Diamond pack on some game, I realized just how out of my depth I was. I'd been planning for retirement. My last day at the shop was supposed to be 2 months after that knock on the door. I'd pictured it clearly. The guys would take me out for burgers and beers, hand me one of those cheesy plaques, and maybe even spring for a gift card to Bass Pro Shops. I'd drive home in the early afternoon, knowing I'd never have to punch a clock again. Instead, I found myself standing in the kitchen at 6:30 a.m., trying to remember which kid liked strawberry jelly and which one hated it, while also packing gym clothes, double-checking homework, and signing a permission slip for a field trip I didn't even know about until that morning. I'd get them into the car, Sophie with her hair neatly brushed after a small battle, Jack with his shoes on the wrong feet because apparently it feels faster that way, and drive the 15 minutes to school. I started to notice other parents in the drop-off line: moms in yoga pants, dads in suits, people who looked like they knew what they were doing. I always felt like the substitute teacher who wasn't given the lesson plan. The house changed, too. My quiet little space became a living thing: backpacks in the hallway, stray Legos hiding like landmines in the carpet, artwork taped to the fridge with crooked magnets. The TV wasn't tuned to the news anymore. It was cartoons, YouTube videos of people unboxing toys, and the occasional family movie night with popcorn bowls bigger than our heads. At first, I thought I could keep my old habits. Get up early, have my coffee, read the paper. But within a week, mornings were chaos. Someone would forget their homework. Someone would spill juice on the kitchen floor. I once found Sophie wearing mismatched socks and a Halloween headband in March because she didn't feel like being boring today. I learned to pick my battles. Money was the constant shadow. I had a small pension, some savings, and Social Security wasn't far off. But kids are like tiny, adorable hurricanes. They blow through your budget before you even realize the wind has picked up. Shoes, clothes, soccer fees, doctor visits. Sophie needed glasses after her teacher noticed she was squinting at the board. Jack needed dental work after a playground accident left him with a chipped tooth. None of it was optional. I sold my fishing boat. The day the man came to tow it away, Jack stood on the porch watching, confusion in his eyes. "I thought we were gonna go fishing," he said. "We will," I promised. "We just won't need a boat for it." That night I took them down to the small pier by the park with a couple of old rods. Jack caught a sunfish the size of his palm, and Sophie caught nothing but tangled line. Still, they laughed the whole time. Maybe I was the only one who felt the loss. The hardest part wasn't the money, though. It was the exhaustion. I'd forgotten how relentless parenting is. There's no shift change, no clocking out. Someone always needs something: help with homework, a snack, a referee for an argument about who gets the last pudding cup. Some nights, after I got them to bed, I'd sink into my recliner and think, I can't do this for another 10 years. And then I'd remember, I might have to. About 2 months in, I got a call from my old boss. The shop was swamped, and he asked if I could come in part-time. At first, I hesitated. How would I manage it with the kids? But the truth was, I needed the extra income, so I agreed. That first morning back, I dropped the kids at school, drove straight to the shop, and for a moment, it felt like I'd stepped back into my old skin. The smell of motor oil and steel, the clang of tools, it was like coming home. But halfway through the day, my phone buzzed with the school's number. Jack had a fever. I left mid-shift, drove to pick him up, and spent the rest of the day on the couch with him curled against me, hot and sleepy. That's when it hit me. My priorities had shifted. The shop could find another mechanic. Jack only had one grandpa willing to drop everything. Sophie started to open up more in those early months. She told me about her best friend, about a boy in her class who made fun of her glasses, about how she missed her mom but didn't know why she also felt angry at her. Jack didn't talk about his feelings much. He just wanted to play, laugh, and sometimes cry when the lights went out. At night, after they were asleep, I'd sit at the kitchen table and think about my daughter, where she was, whether she was okay, whether she'd ever come back for them. I wanted to be angry at her. Sometimes I was, but mostly I just hoped she was finding whatever it was she'd been looking for. One Saturday morning, I took the kids to the grocery store. We filled the cart with cereal, apples, chicken, and enough peanut butter to last a month. At the checkout, the cashier, a woman about my age, looked at me and said, "You've got your hands full there, Grandpa." I smiled. "Yeah, I guess I do." But in the car, on the way home, Sophie asked, "Do you mind when people say that?" "What do you mean?" "Like, do you mind that you have to take care of us, instead of, doing what you want?" I glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Sophie, you are what I want." She looked down, hiding her smile, but I caught it anyway. That was the thing I started to notice in those early days. Every hard moment, the missed sleep, the empty bank account, the aches in my knees from bending over to tie shoelaces, came with something that made it worth it. A drawing Sophie taped to my bedroom door. Jack telling me I made the best grilled cheese in the world. The three of us piled under a blanket on the couch during a thunderstorm, listening to the rain and pretending we were in a secret fort. I was learning something I hadn't understood as a younger man. Raising kids isn't about having everything figured out. It's about showing up, again and again, even when you're tired, broke, or unsure. It's about being there when the knock comes at your door, whether it's literal or just life handing you something unexpected and saying, "Come in. We'll figure it out together." And that's what we did. If you told me 3 years ago that I'd be spending my evenings learning how to braid hair, I'd have laughed you out of the room. But there I was, sitting on the edge of the couch with Sophie in front of me, her hair damp from the bath, my clumsy fingers trying to remember the YouTube tutorial we'd watched together 15 minutes earlier. The video made it look easy: loop, cross, pull, repeat. In real life, it felt like wrestling with fine strands of silk that had a mind of their own. "You're twisting it, Grandpa," Sophie said, glancing at the reflection of my handiwork in the dark TV screen. I thought that's what I was supposed to do. "No, twist is bad, cross over." Jack was lying on the rug nearby, building what he claimed was the biggest racetrack in the world with his Hot Wheels. "She's never gonna let you do it again if you mess up," he chimed in. "Thanks for the encouragement, buddy," I said. Finally, after a few false starts and Sophie's patient coaching, I managed a braid that stayed put, crooked but functional. She examined it in the mirror, tilted her head, and said, "It's not bad, you just need more practice." It was the kind of small victory that felt bigger than it should have. Not because of the braid itself, but because she let me try. The thing about raising kids is that the moments that matter often sneak up on you. It's not the birthday parties or the big holiday dinners. It's Tuesday nights with grilled cheese and tomato soup. It's helping with math homework you barely remember. It's lying on the living room floor making shadow puppets against the wall until someone falls asleep. One Saturday, we decided to go to the park. It wasn't a fancy park, just a few swings, a jungle gym, and a small pond where ducks gathered in the warmer months. The air was crisp, the kind of early spring day when you can smell the thaw in the ground. Sophie brought her sketchbook, Jack brought a soccer ball, and I brought a thermos of coffee. Jack challenged me to a race across the grass. I tried to keep up, but my knees reminded me I wasn't 30 anymore. He won, of course, and threw his arms up like he just scored the winning goal in the World Cup. Sophie sat on a bench, drawing the ducks, her brow furrowed in concentration. When I peeked over her shoulder, I was struck by how much detail she noticed. The curve of a beak, the ripples in the water. She didn't just see, she observed. That night she showed me the finished sketch. "You should frame it," I told her, and I meant it, not because it was perfect, but because it was hers. We started making traditions without even realizing it. Friday nights became pizza and movie night. Sometimes we'd make the pizza from scratch, flour dusting the counters, Jack stealing pepperoni when he thought I wasn't looking. Other times we'd order from Tony's down the street, the owner slipping in extra breadsticks for the kids. On Sunday mornings, we'd walk to the diner for breakfast. The waitress, a cheerful woman named Marlene, would greet us like old friends. Sophie always ordered pancakes with strawberries, Jack got scrambled eggs and toast, and I stuck with coffee and whatever the special was. Marlene started calling us her Sunday crew. Not everything was easy. There were homework meltdowns, arguments over bedtime, and the occasional slammed door. Once, Sophie came home from school upset because some girls in her class had made fun of her shoes. They weren't name brand, just a sturdy pair I'd found on sale. She didn't want to wear them anymore. I sat with her on the porch that evening, the sun setting in streaks of orange and purple. "When I was your age," I told her, "I had one pair of shoes for the whole year. They weren't special. But I learned something. What you wear doesn't make you who you are. How you treat people does." She nodded, but I could tell it didn't fix everything. Still, the next morning she wore the same shoes to school. That felt like a quiet kind of courage. Jack was easier in some ways and harder in others. He was full of energy, constantly moving, asking questions that ranged from "Why is the sky blue?" to "Do you think dinosaurs could ever come back?" He also had a stubborn streak. If he decided he didn't like a food, no amount of negotiation could change his mind. We had a 2-week standoff over broccoli that ended when I started calling them tiny trees and pretended we were giants eating a forest. He loved helping me in the garage. I'd hand him a wrench, and he'd tighten bolts that didn't really need tightening. Sometimes we'd just sit in the quiet, the smell of oil and sawdust in the air, and I'd tell him stories about cars I'd worked on when I was younger. He listened like each one was a legend. As the months went by, I realized something I hadn't expected. I wasn't just teaching them, they were teaching me. Sophie taught me patience, the kind that comes from letting someone learn at their own pace. Jack taught me to be curious again, to look at the world not as a set of routines, but as a place full of questions waiting to be asked. And they both taught me that love isn't about grand gestures. It's about being there, braiding hair badly, sitting on a park bench, eating pancakes at the same booth every Sunday. I thought about their mom sometimes. I wondered what she'd think if she saw us like this. Part of me hoped she'd be proud. Another part feared she'd see what she'd missed and feel nothing at all. But I didn't let those thoughts linger. Life was busy, and in its busyness it was full. One evening during movie night, Sophie leaned against me and whispered, "I'm glad we live here, Grandpa." Jack, half asleep on the other side, mumbled, "Me too." And in that quiet moment, with the glow of the TV on their faces and the hum of the heater in the background, I realized that somehow, without meaning to, we had become a family in the truest sense of the word. There's a strange thing that happens when you're raising your grandkids in a small town. People talk. Most of the time, it's harmless. A smile at the grocery store. You've got your hands full at the gas station. But every now and then the tone changes, just a little, like there's a question they are not asking out loud. It started with subtle comments. One afternoon after Sunday service, a woman from the congregation leaned in and said, "It's so nice of you to help out your daughter like this. I'm sure she'll take them back once she gets her life sorted out." I didn't know what to say. I just nodded and smiled, even though inside I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The way she said it, help out, like I was a temporary babysitter, like this was a favor I'd done that would soon be over. I wanted to tell her that this wasn't some arrangement, that I wasn't just filling in until my daughter felt ready to parent again, that I had been here for the scraped knees, the night fevers, the spelling tests, the Christmas mornings, but instead I let it pass. A few weeks later, I was at the hardware store picking up supplies for a leaky faucet when I ran into an old coworker. "Didn't think I'd see you here on a Tuesday morning," he said. "Yeah, well, the kids are at school." He raised his eyebrows. "Still got 'em, huh? Thought maybe their mom would have stepped in by now." There it was again, that assumption that my role was temporary, that the real parent was somewhere just waiting to reclaim her spot. I didn't know whether to feel angry at him for saying it or at myself for caring so much. The hardest part was at the kids' school. Parent-teacher conferences meant sitting in a small chair across from someone who would inevitably say, "It's wonderful to see grandparents so involved." They meant it kindly, but every time I wanted to explain that this wasn't about involvement. This was about responsibility, about love, about doing what had to be done. Sometimes I caught whispers in the hallway. Other kids would ask Sophie, "Why do you live with your grandpa? Did your parents die?" She'd shrug it off, but I could see the way her shoulders stiffened. One evening she asked me, "Grandpa, do you think Mom's ever gonna come get us?" I took a long breath. "I don't know, sweetheart, but I do know this: you're safe here, and I'm not going anywhere." She nodded, but she didn't smile. Jack handled it differently. If someone asked about his mom, he'd change the subject or make a joke. Once, at a birthday party, a kid teased him, said it was weird that his grandpa packed his lunch. Jack just looked him in the eye and said, "At least my grandpa's better at peanut butter and jelly than your mom," and walked away. I laughed when I heard about it, but later, I wondered if that humor was just his way of protecting himself. What stung the most were the people who tried to give me advice. "You should make her take them back," someone told me at the diner one morning. "She's their mother. She needs to step up." I wanted to ask them what exactly they thought I should do. Hand over two kids who just gotten used to stability. Force them into a situation I didn't trust. Life isn't as neat as people think when they're looking at it from the outside. Then there were the ones who praised me in a way that didn't feel like praise at all. "You're a saint," they'd say, shaking their heads. "Giving up your retirement like that." It always made me uncomfortable because this wasn't sainthood. This was just what you do for family. I hadn't weighed pros and cons and decided the noble route was worth it. I just opened the door that morning and known there was no other choice. Still, I'd be lying if I said the pressure didn't get to me sometimes. There were nights when the house was quiet, the kids in bed, and I'd sit at the kitchen table with a glass of water and think about how people saw us, about whether I was doing right by them, about whether deep down they still wished their mom would come back. One night, I overheard Sophie on the phone with her friend saying, "It's okay. I like living with Grandpa. He's more patient." I didn't know who she was comparing me to, me now or me back when I was just dad to my daughter, but I hoped it was the former. The turning point came one Saturday afternoon at the park. I was sitting on a bench watching the kids play when a man I vaguely recognized from church sat down next to me. "You know," he said, "you should be careful not to get too attached." I turned to him, confused. "Too attached?" "Yeah, If their mom comes back, it could be hard on you and on them. I looked at Sophie, pushing Jack on the swing, both of them laughing so hard they could barely breathe. I think that ship's already sailed, I said, because the truth was there was no line to cross. I wasn't halfway in, waiting to see what happened. I was all in, and no amount of whispered speculation or well-meaning warnings was going to change that. As we walked home from the park, Jack reached for my hand without saying anything. Sophie handed me her sketchbook to hold, trusting me with something she rarely let anyone else see. In that moment, I realized something important. The outside world could say what it wanted. Neighbors could gossip, strangers could make assumptions, teachers could smile that polite smile. But in our little home behind our front door, none of that mattered. We knew who we were to each other, and that was enough. There are days that pass without you realizing they'll matter later. A Tuesday, an ordinary Tuesday, can become the kind of memory you pull out years later, turning it over in your mind like a smooth stone in your pocket. That's what happened the day Sophie came home with the envelope. It was spring, the kind of warm afternoon where you can smell the grass waking up. Jack burst through the front door first, backpack half open, papers spilling out, already talking about how he'd scored 2 goals at recess. Sophie followed behind, quieter, holding her own backpack close. "Everything okay?" I asked. She nodded, but I could see the corners of her mouth twitching like she was trying not to give something away. At the kitchen table, she finally slid the envelope across to me. My name was scrawled on the front in blue ink. Inside was a letter from the school art department, congratulating her for winning first place in the district's annual art competition. Her drawing 2 ducks on a pond, the ones we'd watched that day in the park, had been chosen to hang in the county library for the whole month. For a second, I just stared at the letter. Then I looked at Sophie, her hands twisting together in her lap. "You won," I said, my voice softer than I meant it to be. She shrugged. "I guess." "No guessing about it, you won." I stood, pulled her into a hug, and felt her relax against me. Jack jumped in too, wrapping his arms around both of us. "Does this mean she's famous now?" Sophie laughed, and for the rest of the afternoon the house felt lighter. That Friday evening, the three of us went to the library for the art show. The walls were lined with pieces from kids all over the district, paintings, sculptures, collages. Sophie's drawing was framed in simple black, hanging under a little card with her name and age. I watched from a few steps away as she stood in front of it, Jack at her side, both of them grinning. She didn't notice me wiping at my eyes. People stopped to look at her work, offering quiet compliments. One woman turned to me and said, "She's very talented, you must be proud." "I am," I said, and realized the word proud didn't even come close. On the drive home, Sophie held the small certificate they'd given her, tracing the embossed letters with her fingertip. "Do you think Mom would want to see it?" she asked. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. "I'm sure she would." "I might send her a picture," Sophie said, staring out the window. I didn't say anything else. I just hoped if my daughter saw it, she'd understand what she was missing, not just the art, but the moments like these. That weekend, we decided to celebrate. Not with anything fancy, just pizza from Tony's and a trip to the ice cream shop. Jack tried to talk Sophie into getting a flavor called Cotton Candy Explosion, but she stuck with chocolate chip. We sat outside under the string lights, the spring air cool against our skin, and for the first time in a long while, I caught myself thinking, this feels like the life I was meant to have. It wasn't the retirement I'd pictured. It was better in ways I never could have imagined. The following week brought another milestone. Jack finally learned to ride his bike without training wheels. It had been a slow process. He'd fall, get frustrated, throw the bike down, and declare he was done forever. But that Sunday morning something clicked. He wobbled, steadied, and then took off down the sidewalk, his laugh echoing between the houses. Sophie and I ran after him, cheering until we were out of breath. When he finally stopped, he said, "I told you I could do it." "Yes," I said, ruffling his hair, "after about 50 tries." He grinned. "That's how champions are made." That night after they were in bed, I sat at the kitchen table and thought about how these small victories, an art show, a bike ride, had the power to fill a house with joy. I remembered something my own father once told me. The big moments in life aren't really big. They're just a collection of small ones, piled up until you realize they've made you who you are. Watching Sophie and Jack find their footing in the world was making me someone new too. Someone softer, someone more patient. Someone who saw the value in celebrating the small stuff, because sometimes the small stuff is what saves you. One evening, as I tucked Sophie into bed, she said, "Thanks for being there tonight. For the ice cream. For everything." It was such a simple thing to say, but it stayed with me long after the lights were out. In a world that often overlooked the quiet kind of love, I was grateful that, at least in this house, it was noticed. And maybe that's the thing about these milestones. They don't just mark where the kids are growing. They mark where I'm growing too. It was a quiet October afternoon, the kind where the sunlight comes in low and golden, catching the dust motes in the air. Sophie was at the kitchen table working on her science project, a homemade volcano made from an empty soda bottle and a mountain of papier-mâché. Jack was sprawled on the rug with a pile of Legos, building what he swore would be a battle fortress. I was making chili for dinner when I heard the knock. Not the quick, uncertain knock from 3 years ago. This one was slower, more deliberate, 3 heavy raps followed by silence. When I opened the door, there she was, my daughter. Her hair was shorter than I remembered, dyed a deep chestnut. She wore a jacket I'd never seen before, tailored and clean, and there was a kind of practiced steadiness in her expression. But her eyes, those were the same. A little softer maybe, but still carrying something restless behind them. "Hi, Dad," she said. For a moment I just stood there. All the words I'd rehearsed over the years, questions, accusations, maybe even forgiveness, jammed in my throat like traffic on a narrow road. Finally, I stepped aside. "Come in." The kids froze when she walked into the living room. Sophie's eyes widened, Jack blinked twice and then shot to his feet. "Mom?" Sophie's voice was half surprised, half guarded. "Yes, honey," she said, kneeling down to their level. "It's me." Jack hesitated, then let her hug him. Sophie stood still for a moment before allowing herself to be pulled in too. I watched from the doorway, not sure if I should feel relief, suspicion, or something in between. She stayed for dinner. I ladled chili into bowls while she caught up with the kids, asking about school, their friends, what they liked to eat now. Sophie answered politely, but with the careful tone of someone feeling out the edges of a conversation. Jack, ever open-hearted, told her about his soccer games, his Lego fortress, and how Grandpa made the best grilled cheese in the world. She laughed at that. "I bet he does." After the kids were in bed, we sat in the living room. She looked around as if noticing the framed drawings on the wall, the photographs from the past few years, the little scuffs in the coffee table from Jack's toy cars. "You've done a lot for them," she said. "They've done a lot for me," I replied. She took a breath. "I want to come back into their lives. For real this time." I kept my eyes on the carpet. "And what does that mean?" "It means I want them to live with me. I've got a stable job now, an apartment, I can take care of them." I felt my chest tighten. "They have a home here." "I know," she said quickly, "and I'm grateful, but I'm their mother." The words hung between us, heavy and unshakable. Over the next few weeks she started visiting more, picking them up from school once or twice, taking them to the park, to lunch, to the movies. The kids were excited at first, especially Jack, who seemed to believe her return meant everything would be perfect again. Sophie was more cautious. She'd come home from these outings quieter than usual, retreating to her room with her sketchbook. I told myself I'd give them space, that I wouldn't stand in the way, but inside I could feel something shifting. The routines we'd built, the trust we'd nurtured, it all felt like it was starting to fray at the edges. One Saturday she came over earlier than expected. She had a camera slung over her shoulder and asked if she could take some family pictures with the kids. I watched her arrange them in the backyard, positioning herself in the center, their small hands in hers. She looked happy, radiant, even. Later that week, I saw one of those photos online. The caption read, So grateful for the years I've had raising these two amazing souls. I must have read it a dozen times, my stomach twisting tighter with each pass. The years I've had raising them. My hands itched to type something to correct the record, but I didn't. Not yet. At night, when the house was dark, I lay awake replaying the conversation from that first evening. I'm their mother. The truth of it was undeniable. But so was the truth that for 3 years, I'd been their father in every way that mattered. I'd been the one to wake up with them during storms, to clap in the audience at school plays, to patch the scrapes and pack the lunches. Now, with every visit, I felt her reclaiming that role, not just with the kids but with the world. The first real crack came when Sophie brought home a school assignment. Write about the person who inspires you most. She handed it to me to read. It was about me, how I'd given up fishing and free time to take care of them, how I'd taught her to be kind even when you're tired. I smiled, told her I loved it, and pinned it to the fridge. 2 days later, she told me she was rewriting it. Mom asked if I'd write about her instead. Sophie said quietly. I didn't know what to say. I just nodded, my throat too tight for words. The night after that, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table long after midnight. The chili pot from dinner was still on the stove, the house quiet except for the hum of the fridge. I thought about calling her, about telling her exactly what I thought of her timing, her captions, her request to take them back. But I didn't. Instead, I stared at the photo on the fridge, Sophie and Jack grinning in the park, hair windblown, cheeks flushed. That was the life we'd built, and I wasn't ready to let it go, not without a fight. It's a strange thing, how you can feel the ground shifting under your feet without anyone saying a word. At first, the changes were so small I almost convinced myself I was imagining them. A few missed dinners when my daughter picked the kids up from school. A homework folder left at her apartment, meaning I had to drive across town to get it. Sophie calling her mom more often, the word sounding less foreign on her tongue. But then, little by little, the moments began to stack up. One Saturday morning, Sophie and Jack were still at her place when I got a call from my cousin Margaret. She'd run into my daughter at the farmer's market. She looks great, Margaret said, and so proud of those kids, kept saying how she's raised them to be polite and hardworking. I gripped the phone tighter. She said that. Over and over, Margaret replied, like that's her whole identity now. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, the coffee cooling in my cup. Raised them. The words echoed like a challenge. The following week, Sophie had a school event, an assembly where students were recognized for academic improvement. I'd been there for every one of these over the past 3 years. I left work early, found a spot in the second row, and waited. When Sophie's name was called, she walked onto the stage, grinning from ear to ear. I was about to lift my camera when I saw her glance toward the back of the auditorium. There was my daughter, standing in the doorway, waving proudly. Sophie's smile grew even bigger, and when the principal handed her the certificate, she said into the microphone, "Thanks to my mom for helping me with my reading." My hands froze around the camera. It wasn't that I needed the recognition, but hearing the word mom attached to something I'd been doing every night for 3 years felt like a quiet erasure. Jack was subtler. He never stopped being affectionate with me, but he started talking about staying over at mom's like it was a new adventure. He'd come back with little things, shirts I'd never seen before, a watch too big for his wrist, stories about restaurants I couldn't afford. Once, while we were tossing a football in the yard, he asked, "Grandpa, do you think Mom will let us live with her soon? She says her place is way closer to school." I caught the ball and held it for a moment. "We'll see, buddy." He shrugged and ran to get in position for the next throw, but the question stayed lodged in my chest like a splinter. It wasn't just the kids. I started noticing changes in how my daughter spoke to me. She'd stop by the house and point out things that needed updating: the old couch, the squeaky screen door, the way the bathroom tiles were starting to crack. "It's fine for you," she'd say, "but the kids should have something nicer." I bit back the urge to remind her that the kids had been just fine here, that this was the home where they'd learned to ride bikes, draw ducks, and bake cookies on rainy days. but her words made me feel small, like I was failing them in ways I hadn't even considered. One evening, while making dinner, I heard Sophie laughing in the living room. I peeked in to find her on a video call with my daughter. They were talking about a school art project, and my daughter was giving suggestions, color schemes, themes, even offering to help with the framing when it was done. It should have been a sweet scene, a mother reconnecting with her child. But there was something about the ease between them, the way Sophie didn't even glance over to see me standing there, that made me feel like I was already becoming the background. The tipping point came during a Sunday dinner at my daughter's apartment. She'd invited me over, saying it would be nice for the kids to see us all together. I brought a pie, the kind Sophie liked, and tried to keep my mind open. Halfway through the meal, her phone buzzed. It was a video call from one of her friends. She turned the camera to Sophie and Jack, introducing them like trophies. "These are my kids," she said, her voice warm with pride. "Raised them myself. It hasn't been easy, but I've done my best." I felt my fork pause in midair. She didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge the man who'd been there for every scraped knee, every sick day, every bedtime story. I sat through dessert with a smile that felt like it was painted on, the pie turning heavy in my stomach. That night back at home, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about her words, raised them myself. And for the first time, a thought I'd been avoiding took full shape. Maybe she wasn't just reconnecting. Maybe she was rewriting the story. If she was telling people she'd raised them, what else was she saying? And to whom? I realized then that this wasn't just about pride. It was about the possibility of losing them. Not in the way I had before, overnight with a knock on the door, but slowly, piece by piece, until I was just the man who'd helped out for a while. And that was a loss I wasn't sure I could survive. The call came on a Tuesday morning in late November. I was halfway through packing the kids' lunches, peanut butter for Jack, turkey for Sophie, when the phone rang. It was my brother's lawyer. His voice was steady but formal, the way people speak when they're about to drop news that will change the air in the room. My older brother, Frank, had passed away suddenly the night before. Heart attack. No warning. I set the phone down on the counter, the knife still in my hand, and tried to steady my breath. Frank and I hadn't been especially close in recent years. Life, distance, the usual excuses. But we'd shared enough of the same blood and history that his absence felt like someone had quietly removed a wall from my house. The funeral was small, mostly family and a few of Frank's old fishing buddies. The kids came with me, dressed in the best we could manage. Sophie in a dark dress she didn't like, Jack with his tie slightly crooked. My daughter came too, arriving just before the service started. She greeted me with a quick nod, her eyes already scanning the room. Frank had never married, never had kids. He'd spent his life working on the railroad, saving more than anyone realized, and when the will was read a week later, that's when the trouble began. The will was straightforward. His estate, his house, his savings, his stocks would be left to the individual who has provided the primary care and upbringing for the children of my late nephew's family. It was his way of rewarding the person who'd stepped up for Sophie and Jack, knowing how much they meant to him. When the words were read aloud, I felt a quiet certainty settle in my chest. It wasn't about the money. God knows I hadn't thought much about inheritances. But the acknowledgement that someone had seen and named the years I'd given meant more than I could say. Then my daughter spoke. "That would be me," she said. The room went still. The lawyer cleared his throat. "The will specifies primary care and upbringing from my understanding. I've been their mother since they were born," she interrupted. "They've been living with me." I felt the heat rise in my face. "They've been living with me," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. She glanced at me, her expression unreadable. "Dad, you've helped. But I'm their parent." Helped. The word landed like a blow. The lawyer suggested we step outside to clarify the matter. In the hallway, my daughter crossed her arms. "Look," she said, "I'm not saying you haven't done a lot, but this could really help me get set up for them. Better schools, a better home. Isn't that what you want?" "What I want," I said slowly, "is for the truth to matter." Her jaw tightened. "The truth is they are my children. And for the last 3 years," I replied, "they've been my responsibility." For a moment, I thought she might back down, but instead she looked past me toward the closed door and said, "We'll see what the lawyer decides." Over the next few days, things changed in ways I couldn't ignore. She started keeping the kids longer on her weekends, picking them up early from school without telling me, buying them expensive gifts I could never match. Jack came home one night with a brand new tablet. Sophie had a winter coat nicer than anything in my closet. "You don't have to spend all this money," I told her. "I'm just giving them what they deserve," she said, her voice calm but edged. The kids began to sense something was wrong. Sophie asked me one night, "Why do you and Mom keep whispering when you think we're not around?" I told her we were just sorting out some family matters. She didn't press, but I could see the worry in her eyes. Jack handled it differently. "Mom says she can take us to Disney if she gets the money from Uncle Frank," he announced at breakfast one morning, as if this were some kind of contest I'd been entered into without my consent. I tried to smile. "Disney's nice," I said, "but you know what's nicer? Being with the people who love you." He grinned, not fully understanding, and went back to his cereal. The lawyer set a date for a formal review. He'd gather statements, look at school records, medical records, anything that could establish who had been the primary caregiver. I felt confident until I realized how easy it is to rewrite a story when you've got enough snapshots and charm. I'd never thought to document the hundreds of nights spent making sure homework was done, the doctor visits, the parent-teacher meetings. I hadn't kept receipts for the shoes, the glasses, the soccer uniforms. I didn't have photos of every bedtime story or scraped knee bandage. But she had something I didn't, the title of mother and the willingness to use it like a shield. One night, as I was putting Sophie to bed, she handed me a folded piece of paper. Inside was a drawing me, her, and Jack in front of our house. Above it, in careful block letters, she'd written, "Home." "Why'd you make this?" I asked. "Because no matter what happens," she said, "this is still true." I kissed her forehead and tucked the drawing into my nightstand. It was the kind of proof no lawyer could require, but it was the only kind I needed. Still, I knew proof in the heart wasn't always enough in the eyes of the law. And as the date of the review got closer, I began to feel that slow, cold fear that maybe, just maybe, I was about to lose them for good. It happened on a Thursday. Not a holiday, not a birthday. Just a Thursday, ordinary in every way until it wasn't. The kids had left for school that morning like they always did. Jack with his untied shoelaces, Sophie reminding me not to forget about the bake sale tomorrow. I packed their lunches, waved from the driveway as they got on the bus, and went inside to start the day. Around noon, I got a text from my daughter. "I'm picking them up from school today." That wasn't unusual. She'd done it a few times over the past month, but there was something in the shortness of the message that made my chest tighten. I typed back, "Okay. Will you bring them by after?" She didn't reply. By 6 o'clock, I was pacing the living room. Their backpacks still hung by the door. The chili I'd made for dinner was cooling on the stove. I called her phone, no answer. I called Sophie's little cell, the one I'd given her for emergencies. It went straight to voicemail. At 8 the phone rang. Her voice was calm, too calm. "Dad, the kids are staying with me for a while." "For a while," I said, my voice catching. "What does that mean?" "It means they need stability, and my place is better for that right now." I gripped the receiver. "Better than the home they've had for 3 years." She sighed. "Let's not fight. I'll bring their things by this weekend." Their things, like they were just visitors who'd overstayed. I barely slept that night. I kept hearing the echo of the empty house. No Sophie humming while she brushed her teeth. No Jack's footsteps thudding down the hall. No quiet chatter from their bedroom after lights out. In the morning, I walked past the breakfast table and saw the two bowls still sitting there from yesterday, spoons resting in them like they were waiting to be picked up again. I couldn't bring myself to wash them. By Saturday, she showed up with a box. Not their clothes, not their school supplies, just a few toys, some books, and the framed photo of the three of us from last Christmas. She set it on the counter without looking at me. "They'll still come by," she said. "We'll work something out." "Work something out," my voice cracked. "You've taken them and I didn't even get to say goodbye." Her eyes flickered. You'll see them, I promise. I wanted to yell, to demand answers, but the kids weren't there, and I didn't want my words to turn into weapons that might hurt them later. The days after that felt like walking through fog. The house stayed clean in a way that felt wrong. No socks on the floor, no half-finished art projects on the table. The fridge was too full, the laundry pile too small. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, expecting to hear the creak of little footsteps headed to the bathroom, only to remember there was no one here to make those sounds. I tried to fill the hours, fixed the screen door, cleared out the garage, went for long drives with no destination. But everywhere I went, I saw echoes of them. Jack's handprint still faint on the passenger window, Sophie's favorite bench at the park. One evening, I went into their room. The beds were made, the air faintly scented with the lavender spray Sophie liked. On Jack's pillow was the stuffed rabbit Sophie had given him when he was scared of the dark. I picked it up and sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the quiet press in around me. That's when it hit me, not just the absence, but the weight of it. They weren't just gone. They'd been taken. And there was nothing in this moment I could do to change it. Friends tried to comfort me. It's just temporary, they said. She's their mother. She'll realize they need you. But I'd seen the way she'd been positioning herself. Social media posts, conversations at school events, the story she was telling about being the one who'd raised them. This wasn't temporary. This was her rewriting the ending. The worst part was the silence from the kids. No calls, no texts, no quick good-night messages. I told myself it was because she was keeping them busy, but the truth I didn't want to admit was this: she might be keeping them away. I sat at the kitchen table one night with the drawing Sophie had given me, the one with home written above it. I traced the letters with my finger and wondered if she still thought of this place that way, or if, in the span of a week, she'd been convinced otherwise. It's one thing to lose someone suddenly. You can point to the moment, the cause, the change. But this was different. This was losing them in slow motion, one unreturned call at a time, one visit canceled without explanation. And all the while, life outside my walls went on as if nothing had happened. Inside, I was counting the hours since I'd last heard their voices. And deep down, I knew, something would have to give. Either I would fight to bring them home, or I would watch them fade into a life where I was just a footnote. I wasn't ready to be a footnote. It was a Sunday evening when the world shifted back toward me. I'd spent the day trying to keep myself busy, sweeping the porch, fixing a loose hinge on the back door, reorganizing the tools in the garage. But everything I touched felt hollow. The kids had been gone nearly 3 weeks. I'd left messages, offered to take them for dinner, even suggested meeting halfway at the park. My daughter always had a reason why it wasn't a good week. I was rinsing a coffee cup in the sink when my phone buzzed. At first, I thought it might be her. But the name on the screen was unfamiliar, Caleb P. I almost ignored it. Then I saw the message preview: "Hey sir, I think you should see this." Inside the message was a link to a TikTok video. I clicked, and the first frame hit me like a punch and a hug all at once. Sophie, sitting cross-legged on a bed I recognized as hers, my guest room, back before she'd moved out. She looked straight into the camera, her hair pulled back, eyes bright but steady. "This is for my grandpa," she began. "He's the one who raised me and my brother for the last 3 years." I froze, my thumb hovering over the screen. She went on to talk about how I'd made her lunches, helped her with homework, taught her to ride a bike. She told the story of the duck drawing in the library, of Friday pizza nights, of me braiding her hair, kind of bad but trying anyway. She spoke about the time Jack had the flu and I stayed up all night beside him, just in case. And then she said, "People think our mom raised us. But the truth is, my grandpa gave up his retirement, his boat, and his quiet life to take care of us. And I don't want people to forget that." The video ended with a picture of the three of us on the couch, Jack grinning with a mouthful of missing teeth, Sophie leaning against me, my arm around both of them. Over the picture, in white letters, she'd written, "Thank you, Grandpa, I love you." I sat there staring at my phone, my vision blurring. I didn't even realize my hands were shaking until I almost dropped it. Then I noticed the view count in the corner already in the thousands. By the time I hit refresh, it had doubled. The comments were a flood of hearts and encouragement. This man is a hero. Grandpa of the year. This is what love looks like. And sprinkled between them were people tagging news outlets saying, "Someone cover this story." By Monday morning, it wasn't just TikTok. A neighbor knocked on my door to say she'd seen the video on Facebook. My old boss from the shop left a voicemail saying the guys were talking about it in the break room. A reporter from the local paper emailed me asking for an interview. I hadn't sought any of this. But the truth, our truth, was out in the open now, and it was running faster than any lie could keep up with. That afternoon, my daughter called. Her voice was tight. "Why is Sophie putting our family business online?" "It's not our family business," I said, keeping my tone even. "It's the truth. She's a child. She doesn't understand how this makes me look." "She understands exactly what it means," I replied. "And so does everyone else now." There was a long silence on the line before she said, "This isn't over," and hung up. But in a way it was over, or at least the hiding was. Every message, every comment, every share was like a light switched on in a dark room. People were starting to ask the right questions. Why had the kids been living with me? Where had she been for 3 years? Who had been showing up for them every day? 2 nights later, Sophie called me from her mom's apartment. She whispered into the phone like she was telling a secret. "Grandpa, everybody at school saw the video. My art teacher cried." "I'm glad they know," I said. "I just wanted to make sure you knew I meant it, every word." I swallowed hard. "I do, sweetheart, I do." The video kept growing, tens of thousands of views, then hundreds. People started sending small gifts to my P.O. box. Children's books, soccer balls, even a set of art supplies for Sophie. A local hardware store offered to sponsor Jack's soccer team in my name. It felt strange, all this attention, but I understood the heart behind it. They weren't just responding to the story. They were responding to the truth that had been hidden too long. One evening, as the sun set, I sat on the porch with that old drawing Sophie had given me, the one that said home. The edges were worn now, the paper a little creased. I thought about how easily her voice could have been silenced, how close I'd come to being erased from their story entirely. But she hadn't let it happen. She'd found her own way to make the truth undeniable. And for the first time in weeks, I slept without waking in the middle of the night, without listening for footsteps that wouldn't come. Because now I knew the truth had legs, and it was running straight toward us. The first time I realized the video had changed everything was when the lawyer called me. Not hers, not mine, but the one handling my brother Frank's will. "Mr. Carter," he said, "I've been following developments. It seems public opinion is overwhelmingly on your side." I didn't know what to say. Public opinion wasn't the same as a legal ruling, but in a small town, and especially in a family dispute, it had weight, more than I'd realized. A week later, we met again in that same wood-paneled conference room where the inheritance discussion had begun to unravel. Only this time the air was different. My daughter was already seated, her hands folded, a guarded look on her face. The lawyer cleared his throat. "In light of new information, statements from the children, school records, medical records, and, well, substantial public documentation, there's little ambiguity as to who has been the primary caregiver." He slid a folder toward me. Inside were copies of Sophie's school forms listing me as guardian, the signed consents for Jack's surgeries, the countless attendance slips with my signature. Proof, paper proof. The lawyer's voice softened. "Accordingly, Mr. Carter, the estate will be awarded to you as per your brother's wishes." My daughter's chair scraped the floor as she stood. "This isn't fair," she said. "You're just taking everything." "I never asked for it," I replied, my voice low but steady. "I asked for the truth." She shook her head, but there was no heat in it, just something tired. For the first time I noticed the lines at the corners of her eyes, the way her shoulders sagged as if she'd been carrying more than she could admit. "I thought if I had the money," she said quietly, "I could make it up to them, give them more than you could." I looked at her for a long moment. More isn't always better. In the days that followed, something shifted. She didn't stop seeing the kids, but the tension eased. Maybe it was because the legal fight was over. Maybe it was because the video had reminded her she wasn't the only one who loved them. Or maybe she realized there was no erasing 3 years of history. 2 Fridays later, she called and asked if we could all have dinner at my house. I made pizza from scratch, flour dusting the counters just like old times. Sophie grated the cheese, Jack stole pepperoni when he thought I wasn't looking, and my daughter leaned against the counter, watching us with a faint smile. Halfway through the meal, Sophie reached for her mother's hand and then mine, linking us across the table. "We can all be family, you know," she said matter-of-factly. Jack nodded, mouth full. "Yeah, nobody has to win." My daughter's eyes glistened. "Out of the mouths of babes," she murmured. It wasn't perfect after that. We still had differences. How much screen time was too much, whether Sophie could join the art club if it met late, how many soccer practices Jack could handle without wearing himself out. But those were the kinds of disagreements normal families have. And for the first time in a long time, we felt like one. One afternoon, I found my daughter on the porch swing, sipping coffee. She looked out at the yard where the kids were chasing each other in the fading light. "Dad," she said without turning to me, "I'm sorry." I let the words settle in the air before answering. "Me too, for the things I could have done better, for the things I didn't understand about you." She nodded. "I guess we both had to learn the hard way." The truth is, reconciliation isn't a single moment. It's not a hug that fixes everything or a sign paper that makes the past disappear. It's a series of choices, small, stubborn choices to keep showing up even when it's easier to walk away. And in that sense, I realized we'd all been making those choices for a while now, even her. That night, as I locked up the house, I caught sight of the drawing Sophie had given me years ago, the one that said home. It was still taped to the fridge, the paper a little yellowed, the ink faded. But the meaning was the same, maybe even stronger, because now, home wasn't about who had the deed or who could claim the title of parent. It was about who was willing to stay. And we were all, in our own ways, staying. Life has a way of folding the big moments into the small ones until you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. It's been 6 months since the storm passed. Since the will was settled, the video made its way across the internet, and my daughter and I began the slow, uneven work of building something together again. If you walked into our house now, you might not guess how close we came to losing it all. Friday nights are still pizza nights. Sometimes we make it from scratch. Sometimes we get it from Tony's. Sophie still insists on grating the cheese herself, and Jack still sneaks pepperoni when he thinks no one's looking. My daughter sits at the counter, telling us about her week, sometimes teasing me about my dad jokes, which, as I like to remind her, she's genetically predisposed to find funny. The fridge is covered in new artwork and school schedules, but in the center is that same old drawing from Sophie, home, its edges curling, the tape yellowing but still holding strong. The inheritance from my brother didn't change much about how we live. I fixed the roof, replaced the squeaky screen door, and finally bought a reliable used truck. The rest went into savings for the kids, college, maybe, or whatever dreams they decide to chase. I thought about taking a vacation, maybe to the coast or the mountains, but in the end, I realized I didn't want to go anywhere that meant leaving them behind. These years have taught me enough about absence. The biggest change isn't something you can see, it's the way we talk to each other now. My daughter and I still have disagreements, but they are honest, not edged with the quiet daggers of old resentment. She comes over for dinner more often than not, and when she leaves, she hugs me, not out of obligation, but because she wants to. One night, while we were washing dishes, she said, "I'm glad they had you. I wouldn't have been enough not then." It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was a truth I'd been waiting to hear. I didn't need her to say more. The kids are thriving. Sophie joined the art club at school, her work earning a spot in the county fair. Jack's soccer team, now sponsored by the hardware store, made it to the playoffs. They still fight over who gets the last pudding cup, still argue about bedtime, but they are happy. And when they are happy, the rest is noise. Sometimes, late at night, I think about how close we came to losing this. Not just the inheritance or the legal recognition, but the quiet rituals that make us a family. I think about the morning 3 years ago when that knock came at my door, and how I had no idea it was the start of the most important chapter of my life. If you've been following this story, whether you've watched it unfold in real life, read about it in the paper, or stumbled across Sophie's video on some corner of the internet, I want to say something directly to you. Thank you. Thank you for caring enough to listen. For reminding me in my lowest moments that truth has a way of finding its way to the surface. For sending messages, gifts, prayers, not because you had to, but because you wanted to. Your kindness didn't just reach me. It reached the kids. They know they are loved, not just in this little house, but by people they've never met who still believe in the kind of love that shows up every day. And if you're hearing this on YouTube, maybe on your lunch break or late at night when you can't sleep, if this story has reminded you of someone in your own life, tell them. Call them. Show up for them. Because you never know when the knock at the door will change everything, or when the chance to be someone's safe place will land in your lap disguised as responsibility. So here's my wish for you, from me and from the two kids who still call this place home. May you have the kind of love that lasts longer than the storms. May you have the courage to choose people over plans. And may you always know that even if recognition comes late, it still matters. Thank you for walking through this story with us. May your days be filled with peace, your nights with rest, and your family, whatever shape it takes, with love that refuses to let go.